Since his return to the White House, Donald Trump has not shown much interest in making friends. To date, he's clashed with Canada, with China, with Europe, and well, with practically everyone. We've even seen him argue live in the Oval Office with Volodymyr Zelensky. The new American emperor has started a second term in office that everyone finds sour. Well, almost everyone. And no, I'm not talking about Russia this time.
How Mexico's president became the world's leading Trump whisperer. You're tough. How Mexico's president won Trump's praise. A scientist and leftist with limited foreign policy experience, Claudia Sheinbaum seems to have connected with President Trump.
That's right. Despite supposedly being ideologically poles apart, Claudia Sheinbaum, the Mexican president, seems to be one of the few international figures who managed to take Trump down a peg or two. So if it started with tariffs, it ended, at least for now, like this.
We spoke with the president of Mexico, very nice woman, very fine woman, and she said, well, we spend a lot of money on advertising saying how bad drugs are. They're very rough ads. They show the skin falling off and the teeth falling out. And I think that's an incredible idea. So I thank the president of Mexico, actually. It was a call on tariffs, and we talked about drugs. And she gave me an idea that I think will be very successful.
The question now is whether this will really be a 180-degree turn in the relationship between Trump and Mexico, or if it's simply a self-serving stalemate. And VisualPolitik community, for a decade now, the Republican circle has been targeting Mexico as ground zero for almost all of the United States' ills. This is how Trump himself began his political journey. I'm sure you remember him saying this.
When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people. But I speak to border guards, and they tell us what we're getting.
And even upon returning to the White House, Trump harshly singled out Sheinbaum when these two had virtually no contact. You only had to cast your mind back to the announcement of the tariffs on the 1st of February, with the official White House communique directly denouncing complicity between the Mexican government and the drug traffickers. However, the government that until a few weeks ago was an ally of the drug traffickers now appears to be a partner pampered by the Oval Office.
Como lo menciona el presidente Trump, no se requerirá que México pague aranceles en todos aquellos productos dentro del TEMEC. Nosotros siempre hemos tratado con respeto al presidente Trump y él en las llamadas siempre nos ha tratado con respeto.
And precisely because of all these peculiar moves, it's precisely here that we have asked a number of questions. How is it that Claudia Sheinbaum has become the only leader capable of taming Trump? What has Mexico done to please its northern neighbor? How long can this curious friendship between Mexico's left-wing Morena party and the Republican Party last? Well, today we're going to look at all this and more. Fire up your engines and let's get started. In North America, two realities have always coexisted. Two very different friendships. That of the United States and Mexico, and that of the United States and Canada. Both completely different. Washington has historically gone along very well with its northern neighbor, with whom it evidently had no economic, social, or public safety tensions. It was a quiet neighborhood. In contrast, the southern border was the opposite. For Americans, this is the starting point for what they consider to be the vast majority of their ills. Illegal immigration, criminal gangs, drugs, and all kinds of security problems. And of course, they saw Mexico as responsible for all this, which logically made relations, well, let's just say, they tended to be much colder than they were with Canada. Now, however, the tables have turned. Even if Trump's threats continue, for instance, with the water issue.
Trump accuses Mexico of stealing water from Texas and threatens it with sanctions and more tariffs.
But the truth is that the way in which events are playing out is different. Things now seem to be flowing between Mexico and Washington. And the question is, why? Well, that's precisely what we're going to tell you in this video. We're about to see how President Sheinbaum has played her cards to win the game against Trump. And although we are usually critical, this time we must recognize that the Mexican president has played her cards well.
Sencillamente, entiéndame a mí, que para mí lo más importante es mi pueblo y que yo necesito pues seguir colaborando y cooperando con ustedes, pero necesitamos pues igualdad de circunstancias, ¿no?
VisualPolitik community, the Mexican government has launched a complete strategy. We're going to see it in this video in a moment. But President Sheinbaum has also done something else. The realization that Trump's policy is often driven by impulses that have a lot to do with the feeling he has with his interlocutor. And in this, the Mexican president has been very clever. She has sought a personal and, to some extent, more emotional approach.
She has been dignified and discreet in not looking for a fight. Her natural characteristics are being functional so far in the face of a personality like Trump's.
That and her training also helps her. What training do I mean? Well, although it may seem silly to you, to something that has marked a real turning point. In contrast to her predecessors, Claudia Sheinbaum speaks with Trump in English, which has allowed her to connect a lot more. Let's just say that by not needing translators, Trump is less lazy to talk to her and more receptive. Notice what Trump said when he reversed the tariffs.
I did this as an accommodation, and out of respect for President Sheinbaum, our relationship has been a very good one, and we are working hard together.
Now let's take a look at the strategy outlined by the Mexican government that is helping it to really win over Washington. Pay attention.
And all of a sudden, they do something.
Both Canada and Mexico ultimately escaped much of the first wave of tariffs. The Canadians did so using the old eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth plan.
The United States launched a trade war against Canada, their closest partner and ally, their closest friend. At the same time, they're talking about working positively with Russia, appeasing Vladimir Putin, a lying, murderous dictator. Make that make sense.
Meanwhile, the Mexicans are promising the deployment of more than 10,000 officers at the border, as well as a tightening of customs controls. It was something that, not surprisingly, Trump held up as an example of the result of his doing. Of course, this story hid a little something from Trump. Sheinbaum offered basically the same package that Mexicans always put on the table when Washington tightens the screws. It was nothing new. This news item is from 2021.
Mexico has doubled its detentions of migrants with a deployment of 10,000 troops to its southern border, White House spokeswoman Jen Psaki said on Monday.
But the truth is that they did something else. The Mexican president, in a rather surprising and daring move, told the US president that, yes, he was right, and that there was a problem, and that they were willing to collaborate. But of course, with so many tariffs, and the crisis, and the discontent that such trade punishment would cause, perhaps the Mexican government would not have much incentive to curb the smuggling of fentanyl and other substances into the United States. But if, on the other hand, they collaborated, things could be very different. It was not a threat, but something more veiled, a warning about a certain consequence, about the risk of unintended outcomes. And hey presto, it worked. But by no means is this the end of the story. Under no circumstances can Mexico afford a trade clash with the United States. Well, Mexico cannot afford it, and neither can many of the large US companies, but that is another story. The point is that, for Uncle Sam, Mexico has become a kind of new China. In fact, it's already its largest trading partner. Of course, this fuels a lot of jobs and investment, particularly in the industrial sector, and that entire ecosystem could be put at risk with a trade clash. So, just in case, Sheinbaum's government, besides lending an ear and also giving her warnings, wants to take away any argument. It wants to give Trump a move that he can play when the time comes and forget about Mexico, with all that entails, even if you have to give up a couple of pieces along the way. Now, what does this move consist of, and what exactly are we talking about? You see, Sheinbaum's strategy has three axes, starting with a blitzkrieg against the Sinaloa cartel. Well, let's see, maybe that's too much. Blitzkrieg, no, but there is much more intensity when it comes to searching for arrests and carrying out operations. Let's see if Washington disregards this whole story. Be that as it may, the fact is that in this way, since October, Mexico has been modifying its security policy in an attempt to impose a slightly tougher hand after 6 very soft years under AMLO. And don't forget that, on top of that, the Mexican cabinet generated many doubts, particularly due to Minister Garcia Harfuch's suspected links to narcos in the country.
Omar Garcia Harfuch received bribes, Minilik confesses. In an exclusive interview, the former member of the Sinaloa cartel's top leadership assures that Garcia Harfuch received bribes from the criminal organization.
But despite this, the government has focused its offensive mostly in Sinaloa to seek a kind of media shield.
Trump's threats, Mexico offensive, hit Sinaloa cartel. Several cartel operatives said that for the first time in years, they actually feared arrest or death at the hands of the authorities. The Sinaloa cartel bigwig falls, a blow to drug trafficking that shakes the entire country.
We're talking about an offensive that is part of Operation Northern Border, an operation launched by the Mexican government on the 5th of February, hours after Trump first postponed the tariffs. The question is it working? Well, between 1st of October 2024 and the 23rd of March 2025, authorities claim to have arrested more than 15,800 people for felonies. During the same period, they also seized more than 8,000 firearms and almost 135 tons of narcotics, including more than 1,300 kilos of fentanyl and nearly 2 million fentanyl pills. These are figures they are currently using to boast. In fact, the pressure from the authorities, along with less activity from the drug traffickers, who probably now don't want to display their weaknesses too much, among other things, because it's in Mexico's interest that Mexico goes as unnoticed as possible during these months, has meant that the security situation has improved. Of course, we are talking about Mexico. Don't imagine that the violent areas have stopped being a bloodbath either. For example, according to data from the Secretariat of Security and Civilian Protection, last March, 1,996 people were murdered in the country, and in the last 6 months, there have been an average of 67 people killed violently every day. These are frightening numbers. They are terrible, but even so, they represent a decrease of more than 20%. In fact, to give you an idea, in 2018, there were 100 violent deaths per day on average in Mexico. Truly outrageous. Not surprisingly, all this has surprised experts in the narco world, because until now, every time the government increased the pressure, the narco groups fought back by causing more damage. But this time, that's not happening. And that also raises some doubts about whether we could be in some kind of synchronized operation. In fact, the speed with which the operations and arrests have been carried out is surprising. This has shown that either the authorities have known about the location of many drug trafficking networks for years and have let them operate, or that they have received help. Is this some kind of pact? Tacit or explicit? We don't know. Maybe, maybe not. What is certain is that this time it appears that parallel incentives have a lot of influence. They're all interested in exactly the same thing at the moment, that Washington forgets about them. And of course, these moves help. If the crime numbers go down and there's less scary news, well, that's good. What's more, in the last 5 months, Mexican authorities have seized almost as much fentanyl as was detected in all of 2024. But will this change be permanent? And will the government's increased deployment help to consolidate this situation? Let's hope so. Of course, modifying AMLO's policy is helping a lot. Clearly, this is not the only thing Scheinbaum is doing to try to appease the White House. The Mexican president also ordered a review of extradition requests to see which drug lords she could propose to Washington as an offering, something that ended with the extradition of 29 drug traffickers to the United States, and more are on the way.
Scheinbaum says there are more lists for extradition of suspected drug traffickers from Mexico to U.S.
Perhaps the most iconic case is that of Rafael Caro Quintero, who had been wanted by U.S. authorities for nearly 3 decades. Caro Quintero was one of the most wanted drug traffickers by the U.S. after he tortured and murdered a DEA agent in the 1980s. The case is so iconic that Donald Trump himself made reference to it recently.
Thanks to our efforts, Mexico recently handed over 29 of the biggest cartel leaders, including the depraved kingpin charged with the 1985 murder of DEA agent Kiki Camarena. And that was a big deal, if you know. They've been looking for this person for years, many years, and we got him.
Well, the fact is that these types of extraditions are giving Washington a lot to talk about, where they are even cataloging this new attitude of Mexico as something unique in recent decades.
We have to recognize that the Mexican government and the government of President Sheinbaum has taken very strong measures, which we have never seen in the past, to combat cartels and at the same time against massive illegal immigration to the United States, which crosses through Mexico.
Let's not kid ourselves. It's not like the situation in Mexico has changed overnight, but Rubio saying these things and the Trump administration saying these things, even if it's just to try to get in on the act, shows that Scheinbaum's plan is working. Without doing anything really extraordinary, she has managed to calm the waters and in the process improve the situation in Mexico. Between extraditions, advances in border security, and fentanyl seizure figures, Scheinbaum has managed to put together a narrative with which she seeks to dismantle any new Trump political offensives. And as you can see, for the most part, it seems to be working. In fact, the Mexican government itself is taking it upon itself to bombard Trump's cabinet with figures, reports, and references certifying its progress.
¿Qué sucede? Si nosotros estamos incautando más fentanilo en México, pues va a pasar menos fentanilo a los Estados Unidos. cosa que hemos estado informando cada 15 días.
Even in this case, Sheinbaum has done something else right. She has dared to put the focus on the fact that the problem is not really in the supply of narcos, but in the demand, in consumption. If the narcos have a business, it's because the United States wants to consume. Here, the Mexican president even dared to boast of their success in curbing the spread of fentanyl, and Trump took note.
It's not often that I feel I've learned something from a phone call, because I've had a lot of phone calls over my life. But I realized right then and there what a great idea that is.
Be that as it may, the fact is that this is the strategy with which the Mexican government has sought to calm the waters. Only time will tell if we're facing a real change or a temporary change in the political landscape. But while Operation Northern Border seems to be producing results and several areas of Mexico are now a little safer, there is one question which we have to ask ourselves. Why didn't they do all this earlier? Sheinbaum's government started in October 2024 when Andrés Manuel López Obrador passed the reins to his protege. But the party has already been in the executive for a few years. We're talking about almost 7 years in power, where they did practically nothing. But now, they seem to be getting their act together. They're taking advantage of Trump's offensive to configure a new political order, and more than one person in Mexico is getting nervous. What do we mean? Pay close attention.
Securing power.
Claudia Sheinbaum's arrival to power was full of questions, not because of her electoral possibilities, but because of her profile within the Morena party. The National Regeneration Movement came to power with AMLO in 2018, who was known to be a careful and seasoned politician, capable of pulling strings throughout the country. Sheinbaum, on the other hand, came from being the head of government of the capital, with a highly technocratic profile, and that generated some doubts about her ability to dominate the political scene in a country plagued by drug trafficking, corruption, migration crises, and the persecution of journalists and activists, just to give a few examples. In fact, many politicians around her who also aspired to succeed AMLO believed that her lack of experience would make her prime for manipulation. For this reason, some even speculated that Sheinbaum would be a puppet of López Obrador himself, and that he would actually be the one governing in the shadows. But the truth, in light of some of the key policies he's pursuing, and his shift on security, with the clear abandonment of the hugging policy, that does not appear to be the case. To give you an idea, currently half of Mexicans believe that Sheinbaum is the figure with the most power in the country, well above AMLO, and also surpassing organized crime. And in this, the formation of the cabinet far removed from the pillars of Morena, somewhat closer to technicians or professionals in certain areas, has limited the influence of the party's old-timers in management. And now her success in managing Trump has catapulted her popularity even further. In fact, this new government began with a popularity rating of 73%. That's very high, yes, practically of populism further. Now Sheinbaum's approval has climbed even higher, up to 85%. Quite insane. According to Mexican consultants and political analysts, this is the government with the most popular first half of the year in the country's modern history. And in this, not surprisingly, the shift in security policy has a lot to do with it. And that is excellent news. Do you know why? Because that may mean that this is no longer about pleasing Trump, but about using this avenue to consolidate power. And VisualPolitik community, if there's one thing Mexico needs, it is precisely to put the brakes on its numbers of unleashed violence.
Yo la verdad quiero decir que fuimos tratados con mucho respeto. Digo fuimos, porque sí es a la presidenta de México, pero es al pueblo de México, porque yo represento al pueblo de México.
At the worst moment in relations between the West and Washington, Mexico surprisingly seems to be emerging as one of the least bad countries for Trump. Undoubtedly, this administration is a box full of surprises. The question now, of course, is whether this relationship really has a future, and above all, whether the Mexican state will be able to maintain this momentum in the coming months and years. But as we watch this strange relationship between Sheinbaum and Trump unfolding, it's now over to you. What do you think of this sort of growing bond that is emerging between Trump and Sheinbaum? Do you think it has a future? Or will it blow up sooner rather than later? Will Sheinbaum really want to change the course of security policies in the long term? Or is she just buying time to calm things down with Washington? Well, leave us your opinions below in the comments and let's start a debate. If you like this video, hit the like button and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so. As always, thank you very much for watching. All the best. I'll see you next time.